Eat quietly, Mother Eleanor. You're embarrassing us in front of important people. I felt my face burn with shame as every head at that dinner table turned toward me. But what I discovered in the following days, and the documents I eventually placed in front of them, made their embarrassment at that dinner look like nothing. I'm grateful you're here to listen to my story. Please follow until the very end, and comment which country you're watching from so I can see how far my experience has reached. At 70 years old, I thought I'd developed thick enough skin to handle most of life's cruelties. I'd buried a husband, survived breast cancer, raised 2 sons as a single mother after my divorce, and rebuilt my life from scratch more than once. I'd worked as a school librarian for 35 years, lived through recessions, health scares, and the loneliness that sometimes comes with age. But nothing in all those decades of living prepared me for the particular sting of being humiliated by your own son's wife in a room full of strangers who looked at you like you were something unpleasant they'd accidentally stepped in. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and this is the story of how one terrible dinner party changed everything. It was a Saturday evening in late September when my carefully maintained world began to crack. The leaves in Maple Ridge were just starting to turn golden, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that always reminded me of new beginnings and fresh starts. I'd been feeling optimistic lately, hopeful even. My youngest son, Julian, had been calling more frequently. His wife, Cassandra, had even sent me a birthday card last month, the first personal gesture she'd made toward me in the 3 years since their wedding. So when Julian called me on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice warm and animated, I felt my heart lift with genuine joy. "Mom, Cassandra is hosting a dinner party this Saturday," he'd said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Some important business associates of hers from her real estate firm. She specifically asked me to make sure you were there. She said it wouldn't feel like a real family gathering without you." I'd been sitting in my small living room when he called, surrounded by the modest but comfortable furniture I'd accumulated over the years. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows of my 1-bedroom apartment in the Oakwood Gardens complex, a nice enough place for seniors, with its community center and weekly bingo nights, but a far cry from the spacious house I'd once owned before the divorce settlement and medical bills had whittled down my assets. "Really?" I'd asked, unable to keep the hope and surprise out of my voice. "She wants me there?" "Absolutely, Mom. She was quite insistent about it, actually. Said she's been meaning to include you more in our lives, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity." My eyes had filled with tears. Cassandra and I had never been particularly close. She was 28 years old, beautiful, ambitious, and sophisticated in ways I'd never been even in my youth. She came from money. Her family owned a chain of boutique hotels across the Southwest. When she and Julian had started dating 4 years ago, I'd sensed immediately that she saw me as beneath her station. A former school librarian living on a modest pension and Social Security didn't exactly fit into her world of country clubs and charity galas. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she was finally ready to build a bridge between us. "I'd be honored to come," I told Julian, my voice thick with emotion. "What should I bring?" "I could make my famous apple crumble, you know how everyone loves that. Or perhaps my spinach and artichoke dip." "I could, just bring yourself, Mom," Julian had interrupted, though his tone was gentle. "Cassandra has everything planned down to the last detail. She's working with Harrison's Catering, you know, that upscale place downtown. And she's hired a sommelier to pair wines with each course. It's going to be quite the production." "Oh," I'd said, feeling a flutter of nervousness replace some of my joy. "That sounds very fancy. Are you sure I should be there?" "I mean, if it's that formal." "Mom, stop," Julian had said firmly. "You're my mother. Of course you should be there. Just, maybe wear something nice? It's going to be black tie optional. Nothing too formal, but you know, dressy. Do you have something appropriate?" I'd looked down at my usual uniform of comfortable slacks and a cardigan. "I have my navy dress. The one I bought for your wedding. Would that work?" "Perfect. That dress looked great on you. Listen, I've got to run, meeting with a client, but dinner's at 7 on Saturday. Our address is 4782 Willowbrook Lane in Riverside Estates." You remember how to get there, right? Of course, honey. I've only been to your house once, but I wrote down the directions. Great. See you Saturday, Mom. Love you. Love you too, sweetheart. I'd hung up the phone and sat there for a long moment, my heart full of hope and my mind already racing with preparations. This was my chance to finally connect with Cassandra, to show her that despite our different backgrounds, I could fit into her world. I could be gracious and appropriate and everything a mother-in-law should be. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of preparation. I made an appointment at Sheer Elegance, the hair salon in the shopping plaza near my apartment, and spent money I probably shouldn't have on getting my gray hair styled and highlighted. Margaret, my regular stylist, did a beautiful job, giving me soft waves that made me look at least 5 years younger. I pressed my navy dress carefully, using the iron and ironing board I'd set up in the corner of my bedroom. The dress was simple but elegant, a knee-length A-line with 3/4 sleeves and a modest neckline. It had cost me nearly $200 3 years ago, a splurge I'd justified because Julian's wedding was such a special occasion. On Friday, I went to the mall and bought a new silk scarf in shades of cream and gold to brighten the outfit. I also purchased a small hostess gift, a beautiful scented candle and a crystal holder that cost $45, nearly half of my weekly grocery budget, but I wanted to make the right impression. Saturday arrived with clear skies and that perfect autumn temperature that makes you grateful to be alive. I spent the morning doing my nails, painting them a soft rose color that seemed elegant without being too bold. I practiced my smile in the mirror, rehearsed small talk topics in my head, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach. At 5:30, I began getting ready in earnest. I took a long shower, applied my makeup more carefully than I had in months, and slipped into my navy dress. When I looked at myself in the full-length mirror on my closet door, I felt a small surge of pride. I looked good. Presentable. Like someone who could hold her own at a fancy dinner party. The drive to Riverside Estates took 40 minutes. I left early, not wanting to risk being late, and arrived at the gated community entrance at 6:30. The security guard checked my name against his list and waved me through, and I drove slowly through streets lined with enormous houses that looked like they'd been plucked from the pages of Architectural Digest. Julian and Cassandra's home sat at the end of Willowbrook Lane, a sprawling modern structure that seemed to be made entirely of glass and steel and sharp angles. The front yard was minimalist but immaculate, geometric hedges, a zen rock garden, and landscape lighting that was already starting to glow in the early evening light. A circular driveway led to the entrance, where 2 massive wooden doors flanked by contemporary sculptures stood like sentries. I parked my 12-year-old Honda Civic behind a gleaming Mercedes and a Tesla, suddenly very aware of how out of place my modest vehicle looked in this setting. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my purse and the hostess gift, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. The doorbell played a sophisticated chime when I pressed it, and within seconds, the door swung open to reveal Cassandra. She was breathtaking. Her honey blonde hair was swept into an elegant French twist, her makeup was flawless, and she wore a floor-length emerald silk gown that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. Diamond earrings sparkled at her ears, the ones Julian had given her for their 2nd anniversary, he'd told me proudly, costing $15,000. "Eleanor," she said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "You're here. And you're early." "I'm so sorry," I said quickly, glancing at my watch. It was 6:45. I left extra time in case of traffic, and there wasn't any. "Should I wait in my car until 7? "Don't be ridiculous," she said, stepping back to let me enter. "Come in. Though the other guests won't arrive for another 15 minutes, so you'll have to entertain yourself for a bit. Julian is upstairs getting ready." I stepped into the foyer and felt my breath catch. The space was enormous, with 20-foot ceilings and a floating staircase that seemed to defy gravity. The floors were polished concrete, actual concrete, like you'd see in an art gallery, and the walls were painted a stark white that made everything feel cold and museum-like. A massive abstract painting in shades of black and gray dominated one wall, and a crystal chandelier that looked like it belonged in a palace hung overhead. "Your home is stunning," I managed to say, though in truth, the stark modernism made me uncomfortable. There was nothing warm or welcoming about it. It looked like a showroom, not a place where people actually lived. "Thank you," Cassandra said, already turning away. The architect won several awards for the design. It was featured in Metropolitan Living magazine last spring. "I'll have to show you the article sometime." She led me through the foyer into what she called the living space, an enormous room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a perfectly landscaped backyard complete with an infinity pool that seemed to disappear into the horizon. The furniture was all sharp lines and uncomfortable-looking angles, arranged in precise groupings that looked more decorative than functional. "Why don't you wait here?" Cassandra said, gesturing to a white leather sofa that looked like sitting on it might leave a permanent mark. "Can I get you something to drink? We have champagne, wine, or cocktails." "Just water would be lovely, thank you," I said, perching carefully on the edge of the sofa. "Water," she repeated, and something in her tone made me feel like I'd failed some sort of test. "Of course. I'll have the staff bring you some." Staff. She had staff. She disappeared through a doorway, her silk gown flowing behind her like she was walking a runway, and I was left alone in that cavernous, cold room. I set my purse beside me and placed the hostess gift on my lap, suddenly uncertain whether bringing a $45 candle to a woman who clearly spent that much on a single glass of wine was appropriate or insulting. A young man in a crisp white shirt and black vest appeared a moment later with a crystal glass of water on a silver tray. He set it on a coaster on the glass coffee table in front of me, nodded politely, and disappeared without a word. I sipped the water and tried not to feel out of place. Through the windows, I could see the sun beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but even the sunset felt curated, like Cassandra had somehow arranged for perfect weather to complement her perfect house for her perfect dinner party. Julian appeared about 10 minutes later, descending the floating staircase in a tailored tuxedo that made him look like a movie star. My baby boy, though he was 32 now, had always been handsome, with his father's dark hair and my green eyes, but tonight he looked like he belonged in this world of wealth and sophistication. Like the modest upbringing I'd provided him was just a distant memory he'd successfully left behind. "Mom," he said with genuine warmth, crossing the room to kiss my cheek. "You look great. I love what you did with your hair." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, standing to hug him properly. "You look very handsome." "Is that a new tuxedo?" Cassandra insisted, he said with a slightly embarrassed laugh. "She said my old one was dated. This is Tom Ford, apparently. I don't really know designers, but she assured me it was appropriate." "It's lovely," I said, though I couldn't help mentally calculating how much a designer tuxedo must cost. Probably more than I spent on clothes in a year. "So how have you been?" he asked, settling onto the sofa beside me. "I feel like we haven't really talked in weeks." "I'm good, honey. Same old routine. Book club on Tuesdays, bingo on Thursdays. Margaret next door and I have been taking morning walks together. Nothing exciting, but I'm content." Something flickered across his face, pity, maybe, or discomfort. "That's good, Mom. That's really good. You know, we should have you over more often. I've been meaning to suggest regular family dinners, maybe once a month or something." "I'd like that very much," I said, my heart swelling with hope. Before he could respond, the doorbell chimed its sophisticated melody, and Cassandra's voice called from somewhere in the house, "Julian, can you get that? Our guests are arriving." And just like that, the moment was broken. Julian squeezed my hand and stood. "I should help Cassandra greet everyone. Will you be okay here for a few minutes?" "Of course, honey. You go ahead." Over the next 30 minutes, I watched from my perch on the white leather sofa as Cassandra and Julian's world unfolded before me. The guests arrived in pairs and groups, all dressed in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, all carrying themselves with the casual confidence that comes from never having worried about money. There was Gerald Thornton, CEO of some technology company whose name I recognized from news articles but couldn't quite place. He was in his early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of tan that comes from regular golf games at exclusive country clubs. His wife, Lydia, was at least 20 years younger, dressed in a glittering gold gown that probably cost more than my car, and dripping with diamonds that caught the light every time she moved. Richard Chen and his husband, Michael, were both investment bankers who worked for competing firms but somehow made it work. They were both impeccably dressed in matching black tuxedos with subtle differences. Richard's bow tie was silk while Michael's was velvet, the kind of detail that probably meant something to people who understood high fashion. There was a woman named Stephanie Valdez who Cassandra introduced as her mentor at Preston and Associates Real Estate. Stephanie was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun and a black cocktail dress that showed off her yoga-toned figure. She carried herself like someone used to being the most powerful person in any room. And then came the couple that Cassandra seemed most eager to impress, Victoria and Harrison Blackwell. Harrison owned the Blackwell Hotel Group, a chain of luxury boutique hotels that stretched from Seattle to Miami. His wife, Victoria, sat on the boards of 3 major art museums and chaired the annual Riverside Charity Gala, which Cassandra had mentioned at least 5 times in the past 30 minutes was the social event of the season. The Blackwells were in their 60s, both silver-haired and elegant in that way that comes from generations of old money. Victoria wore pearls that looked like they'd been in her family since the Victorian era, and Harrison had an actual pocket watch chain visible across his vest. Julian brought each guest over to meet me briefly, introducing me as my mother, Eleanor, before whisking them away to join the main group gathering near the windows. I smiled and nodded and said nice to meet you at least a dozen times, but I could tell none of them would remember my name 5 minutes later. To them, I was just Julian's mother, a piece of background scenery that had to be acknowledged out of politeness before moving on to more important matters. The conversation that swirled around me was like a foreign language. They discussed property investments in terms I didn't understand, dropped names of restaurants I'd never heard of, referenced trips to places I'd only seen in travel magazines. Someone mentioned their villa in Positano, and everyone nodded knowingly. Another person brought up the recent auction at Sotheby's, and there was animated discussion about whether contemporary art was a good investment or just a bubble waiting to burst. I sat there on my white leather perch, sipping my water and trying to look pleasant and interested, but feeling more invisible with each passing minute. Finally, at 7:30, Cassandra announced that dinner was ready, and we all moved into the dining room. If I'd thought the living room was impressive, the dining room was something else entirely. The table was at least 12 feet long, made of dark wood that gleamed under the light of 3 modern chandeliers hanging overhead. The place settings were like something from a royal palace, china so fine I could almost see through it, crystal glasses in multiple sizes for different wines, and silverware that probably cost more per fork than my entire kitchen. Cassandra had created a tablescape that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. White roses and orchids marched down the center of the table in low crystal vases. Gold-rimmed chargers sat beneath each plate. Cream-colored linen napkins were folded into elaborate shapes that looked like origami swans. Each place setting had a small card with a name written in elegant calligraphy. I found my name at the far end of the table, squeezed between Gerald Thornton and an empty chair. Cassandra and Julian sat at the opposite end, flanking Victoria and Harrison Blackwell like attendants in a royal court. The power dynamics were immediately clear. Those with status and influence were closest to the hosts, while I was relegated to the far reaches of the table where the conversation would barely reach me. The waitstaff began serving the first course, an amuse-bouche that the server described as compressed melon with prosciutto di Parma and micro-basil, finished with aged balsamic reduction. It arrived on tiny crystal plates, each one a work of art, and probably contained about 2 bites of actual food. I picked up what I hoped was the correct fork and tried to eat as delicately as possible. To my left, Gerald was already deep in conversation with Stephanie Valdez about market corrections and interest rates. To my right, the empty chair remained empty. Apparently someone had cancelled at the last minute. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't even there. They discussed the challenges of finding good domestic help, the decline in service quality at 5-star resorts, the outrageous cost of private school tuition even at the elite institutions. Someone mentioned spending $80,000 on their daughter's sweet 16 party, and everyone agreed it was quite reasonable given the venue. I tried to follow along, tried to find moments where I might contribute something to the conversation, but what could I possibly add? I lived on a fixed income. I bought my clothes at department store sales. My idea of a fancy dinner was the early bird special at Applebee's. The second course arrived, a butternut squash soup with truffle oil and creme fraiche, served in bowls that looked too beautiful to actually use. I lifted my spoon carefully, aware that every movement I made felt clumsy and unsophisticated compared to the ease with which everyone else navigated their courses. That's when I noticed the problem with my dentures. I'd had them adjusted 2 weeks earlier after they'd been causing me pain. The dentist had filed them down slightly, assured me they'd fit better, but they'd been loose ever since. I'd been meaning to go back for another adjustment, but appointments were expensive and I'd been putting it off. Now, as I tried to eat the soup, I felt them shift slightly in my mouth. I tried to adjust them with my tongue, tried to keep them in place, but as I swallowed, they made a small clicking sound. I froze, mortified, my spoon halfway to my mouth. It happened again with the next bite. Click. That small, telltale sound that announced to everyone within earshot that I had dentures, that I was old, that I didn't belong in this world of perfect teeth and perfect lives. I set my spoon down carefully, my face burning with embarrassment, and tried to adjust them more thoroughly with my tongue. But the damage was done. Gerald had glanced at me with barely concealed distaste before turning his full attention back to Stephanie. I decided to skip the rest of the soup course, dabbing at my mouth with my napkin and hoping no one had noticed. The main course arrived, presented by the servers with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for royalty. Pan-seared duck breast with cherry gastrique, accompanied by roasted root vegetables and pommes Anna, the head server announced. The plates were works of art, each component precisely placed, garnished with edible flowers and microgreens, drizzled with sauce in decorative patterns. It looked too beautiful to eat, but everyone else dug in with practiced elegance, their knives cutting through the duck like butter. I picked up my knife and fork, cut carefully into the duck, and brought a small piece to my mouth. And that's when disaster struck. As I chewed, my dentures shifted again. This time, the clicking was louder. More pronounced. Unmistakable. Click. 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 I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized several people at the table had heard it. Lydia Thornton's eyes flickered toward me, then quickly away. Richardson paused mid-sentence in his conversation with Michael. Even Julian looked uncomfortable, though he tried to hide it by suddenly becoming very interested in his wine glass. I tried to chew more carefully, tried to hold my dentures in place with my tongue while eating, but it was impossible. Every bite created that horrible clicking sound that announced my age and infirmity to everyone in the room. That's when Cassandra's voice cut through the dinner conversation like a knife through butter. Eat quietly, Mother Eleanor. You're embarrassing us in front of important people. The words fell into the conversation like a bomb. Every single person at that table stopped talking. Forks froze in midair. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. All eyes turned toward me, some curious, some pitying, some simply uncomfortable. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. My face burned with shame so intense I thought I might actually combust right there at the table. My hands began trembling, and I carefully set down my knife and fork, the clatter against the china sounding deafening in the sudden quiet. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't realize, my dentures have been giving me trouble. I didn't mean to, it's fine, Cassandra interrupted, but her tone made it clear it was anything but fine. Her smile was still in place, but it had taken on a sharp edge that made me think of broken glass. We all understand that aging comes with certain challenges. Just try to be more mindful, please. We're trying to make a good impression on our guests. Victoria Blackwell shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her elegant composure slipping for just a moment as she exchanged a glance with her husband. Harrison suddenly became intensely focused on his duck, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces. Stephanie Valdez cleared her throat and gamely tried to restart the conversation, launching into a story about a recent property showing, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. I had become the evening's cautionary tale, the embarrassing relative who didn't know how to behave in polite company, who reminded everyone of the indignities of aging that they all desperately wanted to pretend would never happen to them. I spent the rest of the meal in absolute silence, my hands folded in my lap, my plate barely touched. I couldn't bring myself to take another bite, couldn't risk making another sound that would draw attention to my inadequacy. My throat felt tight with tears I refused to shed, my chest ached with humiliation, and all I wanted was to disappear, to leave, to never have come to this horrible dinner party in the first place. The servers cleared my nearly full plate without comment, though I caught one of them giving me a sympathetic look that somehow made everything worse. Dessert was served, an elaborate construction of dark chocolate, raspberry coulis, and gold leaf that probably cost $50 per serving. I stared at it without appetite, waiting for the appropriate moment to escape. Around me, the conversation had resumed its normal flow. They were back to discussing vacation homes and investment properties and the challenges of managing multiple residences. Victoria was telling a story about the difficulties of finding qualified staff for their summer house in the Hamptons. Everyone was laughing and engaged, and it was as if my humiliation had been nothing more than a brief, unpleasant interruption to their evening. Only Julian seemed troubled. I could see him glancing at me from the other end of the table, his expression conflicted, but he didn't say anything. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell Cassandra her comment had been cruel. He just looked uncomfortable and guilty and then turned his attention back to Harrison Blackwell, who was saying something about a potential business partnership. When the last of the dessert plates were cleared and coffee was served, I saw my opportunity to escape. I stood carefully, smoothed my navy dress, and tried to catch Julian's eye. Cassandra noticed first. "Leaving so soon, Eleanor?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "I have an early morning tomorrow," I lied. "But thank you so much for including me. Everything was lovely." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but what else could I say? The truth? That this had been one of the most humiliating experiences of my life? That my own son's wife had publicly shamed me in front of strangers? That I felt smaller and more worthless than I had in years? Julian stood quickly. "Mom, let me walk you out." "That's not necessary, I insist," he said, and there was something in his voice, guilt, perhaps, that made me nod. He walked me to the front door in silence, and when we reached my car in the driveway, he finally spoke. "Mom, I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable tonight." If I felt uncomfortable. As if my feelings might be misplaced or exaggerated. "It's fine, Julian," I said, because that's what mothers do. We lie and minimize and pretend our hearts aren't breaking so our children don't have to feel bad. "Look, Cassandra, she's under a lot of pressure right now. She's trying to make partner at her firm, and these connections are really important. The Blackwells could open so many doors for her. She just needs everything to be perfect." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't. Even though I couldn't understand how impressing strangers could be more important than treating family with basic human decency. "Good. I knew you would. You've always been so understanding, Mom." He hugged me briefly, kissed my cheek. "Drive safe. I'll call you next week." He was back inside the house before I'd even started my car, eager to return to his important guests and his sophisticated life and his beautiful wife who had just humiliated his mother in front of a roomful of strangers. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The 40-minute drive felt endless. I kept replaying that moment over and over in my mind. "Eat quietly, Mother Eleanor. You're embarrassing us in front of important people." By the time I pulled into my parking spot at Oakwood Gardens, my face was wet with tears I didn't remember starting to cry. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing Cassandra's voice, kept seeing the pitying looks from the other guests, kept feeling the burn of that public shame. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back at that table, clicking dentures and all, the old woman who didn't belong. Sunday morning arrived with gray skies that matched my mood. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, staring at nothing, feeling hollowed out and exhausted. That's when I noticed my laptop still sitting where I'd left it the night before, open to my email. There was an unread message that had arrived yesterday afternoon while I was getting ready for the dinner party, an automatic notification from Pemberton Property Management, the company that had been handling my late husband's rental properties for the past 5 years. My husband, Robert, had died 5 years ago after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. In the settlement of his estate, I'd inherited 3 small rental properties, a duplex in the Oak Hills neighborhood, a single-family home near the university, and a small commercial space downtown. The rental income from these properties, combined with my pension and Social Security, was what I lived on. I'd turned the management of the properties over to Pemberton immediately, not wanting to deal with tenants and maintenance issues on my own. Every month, I received an automatic report detailing the rental income, expenses, and any issues that needed my attention. Usually, I just glanced at these reports to confirm that the money had been deposited into my account and then filed them away. But this month's report looked different. I clicked it open, frowning as I scanned the document. There were the usual 3 properties listed with their addresses and rental amounts. But then, below them, was a section I'd never seen before, additional properties under management. And there, in black and white, was an address I recognized immediately, 4782 Willowbrook Lane, Riverside Estates. Julian and Cassandra's house. My hands began to tremble as I read the details. The property was listed as owned by Whitmore Family Trust, with me listed as the trustee. Monthly management fee, $2,500. Property type, single-family residence. Rental status, occupied. But that couldn't be right. Julian and Cassandra had bought that house 3 years ago, just after their wedding. Julian had told me all about it, how Cassandra's real estate success and his promotion to senior account manager had finally made it possible for them to afford their dream home. How they'd beaten out 5 other offers. How excited they were to finally own property in Riverside Estates. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold beside me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Unless they hadn't bought it at all. Unless someone else owned it and they were living there as tenants. Unless that someone was me. But that was impossible. I would know if I owned a multi-million-dollar property in Riverside Estates. Wouldn't I? With shaking fingers, I opened my banking app and scrolled through my recent deposits. Sure enough, there were the usual rental deposits from my 3 known properties. But there, I found additional deposits I'd never questioned, had barely noticed, monthly payments of $4,500 going back 3 years, labeled simply as property income. I'd always assumed those were from increased rents on my existing properties, or perhaps some investment dividend I'd forgotten about. I received so many automatic deposits and payments that I'd stopped scrutinizing each one. But $4,500 a month for 3 years added up to $162,000 in rental income one hadn't realized I was receiving. My heart was pounding now, that hollow feeling in my chest replaced by something else. Confusion. Suspicion. And underneath it all, a growing sense that something was very, very wrong. I picked up my phone and called Pemberton Property Management. It was Sunday morning, so I only got their answering service, but I left an urgent message asking someone to call me back as soon as possible. Then I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen, and tried to understand how my son could be living in a house that I apparently owned without my knowledge. And I wondered what else I didn't know about Julian and Cassandra's perfect life. The phone call from Pemberton Property Management came at 8:30 Monday morning, just as I was pouring my 3rd cup of coffee. I'd barely slept again, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind churning through possibilities and explanations that all seemed equally impossible. Mrs. Whitmore? This is Denise Carmichael from Pemberton Property Management. I received your message from yesterday. You said it was urgent? I gripped the phone tighter, suddenly unsure how to voice the questions swirling in my mind without sounding completely insane. Yes, thank you for calling back so quickly. I received my monthly report on Saturday, and I noticed something unusual. There's a property listed that I don't remember adding to my portfolio. Oh. Denise's voice was professionally pleasant but slightly confused. Which property are you referring to? 4782 Willowbrook Lane in Riverside Estates. The report says it's owned by the Whitmore Family Trust with me as trustee, but I don't remember purchasing that property or setting up any trust. There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicking in the background. Let me pull up your account. Just a moment. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I wondered if Denise could hear it through the phone. Okay, I'm looking at your file now. Yes, the Willowbrook property was added to our management services 3 years ago, in October 2022. According to our records, the property was transferred into the Whitmore Family Trust in September of that year, with you listed as the primary trustee and beneficiary. We have all the documentation on file, the trust papers, the deed transfer, everything properly notarized and recorded with the county. My mouth went dry. I see. And who arranged for this property to be added to your management services? More keyboard clicking. Let me check. It looks like the initial setup was handled by Julian Whitmore. Is that your son? The coffee I'd just swallowed turned to acid in my stomach. Yes. Julian is my son. He came into our office with all the paperwork already completed. He explained that you'd recently established the trust for estate planning purposes and wanted to consolidate all your rental properties under our management. He had your power of attorney documentation, so we were able to set everything up without needing to bring you in personally. We thought we were doing you a favor, actually, making it easier for you. Power of attorney. The words echoed in my head like a death knell. Mrs. Whitmore? Are you still there? Yes, I managed to say. I'm here. Can you tell me who the current tenants are at that address? Of course. Let me see. The tenants are listed as Julian Whitmore and Cassandra Whitmore. They've been excellent tenants, actually. Never late on rent, take good care of the property. The monthly rent is $4,500, which is quite reasonable for a property of that size in Riverside Estates, though your son did negotiate the rate down from our initial assessment of $6,000. Of course he did. Julian was living in a house I owned, a house I didn't even know I owned, and paying himself discounted rent with my own money. And the rental payments, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. They've been paid consistently for 3 years? Every single month, like clockwork. The payments are automatically deposited into your account ending in 7823. Is there a problem, Mrs. Whitmore? You sound concerned. Account ending in 7823. That was my main checking account, the one where all my income was deposited. I'd been receiving those $4,500 monthly payments for 3 years and had never questioned where they came from, had never connected them to a property I supposedly owned. No problem, I lied. I'm just trying to get my records organized. One more thing, do you have information about when and how the property was originally acquired? Let me check the file notes. According to our records, the property was purchased in August 2022 for $1.2 million. It was bought outright, no mortgage. The funds came from the sale of another property that had been in your late husband's name. Does that help? $1.2 million. The number made my head spin. Which property was sold? It says here it was a commercial building downtown, address 450 Commerce Street. Ring any bells? It did. That had been Robert's pride and joy, a 4-story brick building in the revitalized downtown area that he'd purchased in the 1990s for almost nothing and watched appreciate in value as the neighborhood transformed. When he died, I'd known it was part of the estate, but the lawyers had handled everything, and I'd been so overwhelmed with grief and medical bills that I hadn't paid close attention to the details. Yes, I whispered. I remember that property. Well, according to our notes, it sold in July 2022 for $1.4 million. After taxes and fees, the net proceeds were used to purchase the Willowbrook property, with the remainder placed in the trust's operating account for property maintenance and expenses. So Julian had sold Robert's building, a property worth $1.4 million, and used the money to buy himself a mansion in Riverside Estates. Then he'd set up this elaborate scheme where he paid me rent on my own property, probably using the rental payments to justify living far beyond what his actual salary could afford. Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, is everything all right? You sound quite upset. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I'm fine, Denise. Just surprised. I'm 70 years old, and sometimes the details of these financial arrangements slip my mind. I apologize for bothering you with questions about things I should already know. Oh, don't apologize. That's what we're here for. And honestly, you're lucky to have a son who's so on top of managing these things for you. A lot of our elderly clients don't have family members who are willing to handle the complicated financial stuff. Lucky. Yes, I was so very lucky to have a son who'd stolen my property, forged my signature, and set up an elaborate scheme to live in luxury on my dime while treating me like an embarrassment. Thank you for your time, Denise. You've been very helpful. Anytime, Mrs. Whitmore. And just so you know, we'll be sending out the quarterly reports next week with more detailed breakdowns. If you have any other questions after reviewing those, please don't hesitate to call. I hung up and sat perfectly still at my kitchen table, staring at my phone like it was a live grenade. Power of attorney. That meant Julian had legal authority to act on my behalf, to sign documents in my name, to make financial decisions without consulting me. But I'd never given him power of attorney. Had I? I tried to remember the weeks after Robert's death. Everything from that time was a blur of grief, medical appointments, legal meetings, and crushing exhaustion. The cancer had taken Robert so quickly, diagnosed in March, dead by June. The lawyers had descended immediately, papers to sign, decisions to make, estate matters to settle. Julian had been there through all of it, helping me navigate the legal maze, explaining things in simple terms, handling phone calls and appointments when I was too overwhelmed to function. He'd been my rock, my support system, the devoted son who'd taken time off work to help his grieving mother manage the overwhelming responsibility of settling an estate. Had I signed a power of attorney during that time? Had Julian put a document in front of me while I was crying or medicated or just too exhausted to read carefully, and had I signed it without understanding what I was agreeing to? I pulled out the filing box where I kept important documents, birth certificates, my marriage license, Robert's death certificate, insurance papers. I rifled through everything, my hands shaking, looking for any kind of power of attorney document. Nothing. But that didn't mean it didn't exist. It just meant I didn't have a copy, or I'd lost it, or it had never been given to me in the first place. I needed to see the actual documents. I needed to understand exactly what had been done in my name. I grabbed my purse and keys and drove to Pemberton Property Management's office in the Riverside Professional Plaza. The morning traffic was heavy, giving me too much time to think, to let my mind spiral through worst-case scenarios. The office was on the third floor, a sleek modern space with glass walls and minimalist furniture. The receptionist, a young woman with pink-streaked hair and multiple ear piercings, looked up from her computer with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I just spoke with Denise Carmichael about an urgent matter regarding my properties. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Is she available?" The receptionist checked her computer. "She's in a meeting right now, but I can see if she can spare a few minutes. Please have a seat." I sat in one of the uncomfortable modern chairs and waited, my knee bouncing nervously. Around me, the office hummed with quiet efficiency. People in business casual attire moved between offices, carrying folders and coffee cups, living their normal Monday morning lives while mine fell apart. Denise appeared after about 10 minutes, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a kind face that immediately made me trust her. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm so glad you came in. When we spoke on the phone, you sounded quite distressed. Please, come back to my office." She led me to a small but tidy office overlooking the parking lot and gestured for me to sit in one of the visitor chairs while she settled behind her desk. "Now, what can I help you with? You mentioned wanting to see documentation." "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I need to see all the paperwork related to the Whitmore family trust and the Willowbrook property. The trust documents, the deed transfer, the power of attorney, everything." Denise's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "Of course. Give me just a moment to pull the file." She turned to her computer, typing quickly, then rose and went to a filing cabinet against the wall. She returned with a thick manila folder and set it on the desk between us. This is everything we have on file. Would you like to review it here, or would you prefer copies to take with you? Both, if possible. I'd like to look through it now, and then take copies home. Absolutely. Let me know if you have any questions. She opened the folder, and I leaned forward, my heart pounding as I began to examine the documents that had apparently reorganized my entire financial life without my knowledge. The first document was the Whitmore Family Trust Agreement, dated September 15, 2022. It was dense with legal language, but the basic structure was clear enough. The trust was established with me as the grantor, trustee, and primary beneficiary. Upon my death, the assets would pass to Julian as the successor trustee and beneficiary. At the bottom of the document was a signature that was supposed to be mine. I stared at it, my vision blurring slightly. The signature looked like mine, the distinctive way I looped the E in Eleanor, the long tail on the R in Whitmore. But something about it felt wrong. The pressure was too even, too careful. When I signed documents, my hand usually shook slightly, especially after Robert's death when I was on anxiety medication. This signature was too smooth, too perfect. Mrs. Whitmore? Is something wrong? I looked up at Denise, who was watching me with growing concern. This signature. Did you witness me signing this? No, it was already signed when your son brought it in. But it was notarized, see? There's the notary seal and signature right there. I looked at the notary information. The name was Patricia Chen, Notary Public. The date was September 15, 2022. The location was listed as Whitmore Residence. Do you have contact information for this notary? I'd like to speak with her. Denise's concern deepened. Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, are you suggesting that this signature isn't yours? Because if there's been some kind of fraud, I'm not suggesting anything yet, I said quickly, not wanting to alarm her before I had all the facts. I'm just trying to piece together my memories from that time. I was dealing with a lot after my husband's death, and some of the details are fuzzy. I want to make sure I understand everything correctly. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. The notary information should be in the file. Let me see. She flipped through several pages and pulled out a business card that had been stapled to one of the documents. Here. Patricia Chen, Mobile Notary Service. Her contact information is all there. I copied down the number, then continued through the file. The next document was the deed transfer for 450 Commerce Street, Roberts Building, showing its sale in July 2022 for $1.4 million. Then came the purchase agreement for 4782 Willowbrook Lane, dated August 2022, showing the property bought for $1.2 million in cash by the Whitmore Family Trust. And finally, there was the power of attorney document. This one was dated June 10, 2022, just days after Robert's death. It granted Julian Whitmore full power of attorney to act on my behalf in all financial and legal matters. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but again, something felt off about it. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. If these signatures were forged, if Julian had created these documents without my knowledge or consent, then he'd committed multiple felonies. Fraud, forgery, theft, elder abuse, the charges would be serious. But if I'd actually signed them during that horrible fog of grief and medication and exhaustion after Robert's death, then everything was legal, if morally questionable. Julian would have had the legal right to sell Robert's building, establish the trust, buy the Willowbrook property, and rent it to himself at below market rates. Mrs. Whitmore, I really think we should discuss what's concerning you, Denise said gently. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding or unauthorized activity, we need to address it. Our firm could be liable if we've been managing a property based on fraudulent documents. I looked at her kind face and made a decision. Denise, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't remember signing any of these documents. I don't remember establishing this trust, selling that building, or buying the Willowbrook property. But I was in a very bad place emotionally after my husband died, and it's possible I signed things without fully understanding them. Oh dear, she said softly. That's quite a serious situation. I know. And I need to figure out what really happened before I make any accusations. Can I get copies of everything in this file? Of course. Let me take this to the copy room. I'll be right back. While she was gone, I pulled out my phone and called the number for Patricia Chen, mobile notary. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. You've reached Patricia Chen, mobile notary service. I'm unable to take your call right now, but please leave a message with your name, number, and the nature of your inquiry, and I'll return your call as soon as possible. Ms. Chen, my name is Eleanor Whitmore. You notarized some documents for me in September 2022, and I'm trying to verify the details of that transaction. It's quite important. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. I left my number and hung up. Denise returned with a thick stack of copies and a large envelope. Here's everything. Mrs. Whitmore, I really think you should consult with an attorney about this. If there's any possibility that these documents were executed without your full understanding or consent, you need legal representation. I know, I said, taking the envelope. Thank you for your help, Denise. And please, don't mention this conversation to anyone yet. Not until I've had a chance to investigate further. I have to be honest with you, if I have reason to believe fraud has occurred, I'm obligated to report it. I understand. Just give me a few days to get my facts straight. If I find evidence of actual fraud, I'll be the first one to report it. I promise. She looked conflicted but finally nodded. A few days. But Mrs. Whitmore, please be careful. Elder financial abuse is more common than you might think, and it's often committed by family members. People we trust. I left the office with the envelope clutched against my chest, feeling like I was carrying evidence of my own son's betrayal. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur, my mind churning through everything I'd learned. Back home, I spread all the documents out on my kitchen table and called Julian's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Julian, it's Mom. I need to talk to you about something important. Please call me back as soon as you get this message. Then I tried his office number. His assistant, a cheerful woman named Brianna, answered on the second ring. Whitmore Financial Consulting, this is Brianna. Brianna, hi, this is Eleanor Whitmore, Julian's mother. Is he available? Oh, hi Mrs. Whitmore. I'm sorry, but Julian's in meetings all day today. He has back-to-back appointments until 6 this evening. Can I take a message? Yes, please ask him to call his mother as soon as possible. It's urgent. Of course. I'll make sure he gets the message the moment he's free. I hung up, frustration mounting. I needed answers, and I needed them now. That's when I remembered Margaret, my neighbor. Margaret Porter was 73, a retired paralegal who'd worked for a family law firm for 40 years before retiring. We'd become friends over the past year, bonding over morning walks and weekly coffee dates. If anyone could help me understand these legal documents, it was Margaret. I gathered up all the copies and walked across the hallway to her apartment, knocking gently on her door. Margaret answered wearing a floral house dress and reading glasses pushed up on top of her gray curls. Eleanor. This is a nice surprise. Come in, dear. I just made a fresh pot of coffee. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine but felt completely different, warm and cluttered in a comfortable way, with plants on every surface and photographs covering the walls. Margaret, I need your help, I said without preamble. Something's happened, and I don't know what to do. Her cheerful expression shifted to concern immediately. Sit down, honey. Tell me everything. So I did. I told her about the horrible dinner party, about discovering the property management report, about the phone call with Denise and the documents that reorganized my financial life without my knowledge. I spread the copies across her dining table, and she put on her reading glasses and began examining them with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reviewing legal documents. She was quiet for a long time, occasionally making small humming sounds or circling passages with a pencil. I sat beside her, drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching her work through the papers with professional efficiency. Finally, she sat back and looked at me with an expression that made my stomach drop. Eleanor, I'm going to ask you a very direct question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you remember signing any of these documents? No, I said firmly. I remember signing a lot of papers after Robert died, insurance forms, death certificates, bank documents. But I don't remember anything about establishing a trust or selling Robert's building or buying a new property. And during that time, were you on any medications that might have affected your memory or judgment? I thought back to those awful months. Yes. My doctor prescribed Xanax for anxiety and Ambien for insomnia. I was taking them regularly. Margaret nodded grimly. And who was with you during most of the legal proceedings? Julian. He took time off work to help me navigate everything. He was wonderful, really. So supportive and patient. I'm sure he was, Margaret said, and something in her tone made me look at her sharply. Margaret, what are you thinking? She tapped the power of attorney document with her finger. Eleanor, this document was executed on June 10, 2022. That's 5 days after Robert's death. You would have been in the deepest part of your grief, probably heavily medicated, barely functional. Yes, that sounds right. And yet this document is very specific and very comprehensive. It grants Julian complete control over all your financial affairs, the ability to buy and sell property, access all your accounts, make investments, everything. Do you remember being in any condition to understand and agree to something that significant just 5 days after your husband died? No, I whispered. I was a mess. I could barely remember to eat. Exactly. She pulled out the trust document next. This was executed in September, 3 months later. You would have been doing slightly better by then, but still grieving, still medicated. This trust essentially puts all your assets under Julian's control, both now as trustee who can make decisions on your behalf, and later as the beneficiary who inherits everything. But if I signed them? Eleanor, look at these signatures. She placed several documents side by side, the power of attorney, the trust agreement, and the deed transfer. Look at them carefully. Are those your signatures? I examined them closely, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. The more I looked, the more certain I became. They look like my signature, but they're not quite right. The loops are too perfect, the pressure too even. When I sign documents, especially during that time when I was so anxious, my hand shakes a little. These are too smooth. That's what I thought, Margaret said quietly. Eleanor, I think these signatures were forged. I think Julian created these documents, signed your name, and had them notarized by someone who was in on the scheme or who didn't properly verify your identity. The room seemed to tilt around me. My son wouldn't do that. Julian is a good person. He's always been so caring, so devoted, has he? Margaret asked gently. Or has he been patient and attentive because he was planning this? Think about it, Eleanor. He sold a property worth $1.4 million, used the money to buy himself a mansion, set up a scheme where you pay him to live in your own house, and arranged it all so that when you die, he inherits everything. That's not the behavior of a caring son. That's the behavior of a con artist. But Cassandra must know about this. She lives there too. Is she part of it? Almost certainly. Think about how she treated you at that dinner party. She humiliated you in front of guests, made you feel small and worthless. That's a classic technique used by financial abusers. They devalue their victims, make them feel incompetent and embarrassed, so the victims are less likely to question financial arrangements or assert themselves. I felt tears streaming down my face. So the whole dinner party, the public humiliation, telling me to eat quietly, it was all part of making me feel like I'm too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs? I think so. They've been stealing from you for 3 years, Eleanor. They're living in luxury on your money, and they need you to feel grateful for any crumbs of attention they throw your way. They need you to feel like you're the problem, like you're the embarrassing old woman who should be thankful she's even included in their lives. The full weight of it hit me then. Not just the financial theft, though losing control of a $1.2 million property was devastating, but the emotional manipulation. The calculated cruelty. The systematic destruction of my dignity and self-worth, all in service of a con game. What do I do? I asked through my tears. Margaret squeezed my hand. First, we document everything. We get expert opinions on these signatures. We track down the notary and find out if she actually witnessed you signing these documents or if she was part of the fraud. We gather evidence. And then you decide how far you want to take this. If these documents are fraudulent, Julian has committed serious crimes. Elder financial abuse, forgery, fraud, he could go to prison. He's my son, I whispered. He's also a thief who's been stealing from you for years while making you feel worthless. Margaret's voice was firm but kind. You need to decide what matters more, protecting him from the consequences of his crimes, or protecting yourself and making sure he can't do this to you anymore. I sat there in Margaret's cluttered, comfortable apartment, looking at the evidence of my son's betrayal spread across her dining table, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who'd sat at that dinner table on Saturday night, accepting humiliation because she didn't want to make waves, who'd apologized for her clicking dentures and her mere existence, that woman was gone. In her place was someone harder. Someone who'd been pushed too far. Someone who deserved better than to be stolen from by her own child. I want to know the truth, I said, wiping my tears away. I want to know exactly what they did and how they did it. And then I want them to face consequences. Margaret smiled grimly. Then let's get to work. We spent the rest of the afternoon and into the evening making phone calls, taking notes, creating a timeline of events. Margaret called a friend who was a forensic document examiner and made an appointment for later in the week to have the signatures analyzed. I called my bank and requested detailed records of all transactions related to the property sales and purchases. Patricia Chin, the notary, finally called back at 6:30 that evening. Mrs. Whitmore? This is Patricia Chin returning your call. You said you had questions about documents I notarized in September 2022. Yes, I said, my voice steady now. You notarized a trust agreement for the Whitmore Family Trust. I need to know, did you actually witness me signing that document? There was a pause. Let me check my records. September 2022. Yes, I have a record of that appointment. It was at your home on Willowbrook Lane. You and your son were both present. My heart sank. My home on Willowbrook Lane? That's not my home. I've never lived there. Another pause, longer this time. Are you sure? My notes say specifically that I met you at 4782 Willowbrook Lane. Your son answered the door, and you were in the living room. We sat at the dining table, I verified your identification, and I watched you sign the documents. What identification did you verify? Your driver's license. I always check photo ID and keep copies for my records. Ms. Chen, I need you to look at those records very carefully. What did I look like when you saw me in September 2022? Well, let me see. According to my notes, you were a blonde woman, mid-60s, appeared to be in good health. You were dressed quite elegantly, if I remember correctly. I looked at Margaret, who was listening on speakerphone, and saw my own horror reflected in her expression. Ms. Chen, I have gray hair, not blonde. And in September 2022, I was recovering from breast cancer treatment. I would not have appeared to be in good health. I think the woman you met was not me. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, if what you're saying is true, then I notarized documents for someone impersonating you. That's a serious crime. I could lose my license. Yes, I said coldly. It is a serious crime. And I'm going to need copies of all your records from that appointment, your notes, the copy of the ID you verified, everything. Because I'm going to the police, and you're going to be a witness.
Oh my God, she breathed. I'm so sorry. I never thought. Your son seemed so legitimate, so professional. He said you were elderly and confused sometimes, that he was helping you manage your affairs. He was so convincing. I'm sure he was, I said bitterly. He's had a lot of practice lying. After I hung up, Margaret and I looked at each other across her dining table, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that was even more elaborate than we'd imagined. They used an impersonator, Margaret said slowly. Someone who pretended to be you, so the notary would validate the documents. That's sophisticated, Eleanor. That takes planning and resources. Cassandra, I said suddenly. It must have been Cassandra. She's blonde, and with the right makeup and clothes, she could probably pass for an older woman. The notary said the woman was mid-60s, dressed elegantly. That sounds like Cassandra playing a role. So Julian and Cassandra worked together to defraud you. They forged documents, used an impersonator, deceived a notary, and stole $1.4 million worth of property from you, all while making you feel like you should be grateful for their attention. I stood up, gathering all the documents together with shaking hands. I need to go home and think. This is too much to process right now. Eleanor, before you go, are you going to confront them? I looked at my friend, this woman who'd spent the past 6 hours helping me uncover my son's betrayal, and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with steely determination. Not yet, I said. First, I'm going to gather every piece of evidence I can find. I'm going to build a case so airtight that they can't lie their way out of it. And then, when I have everything I need, I'm going to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a 70-year-old woman you've written off as an embarrassment. Margaret smiled. That's my girl. Remember, you're not helpless. You're not incompetent. You're not an embarrassment. You're a woman who's been wronged, and you have every right to seek justice. I hugged her tightly. Thank you, Margaret. For everything. That's what friends are for. Now go home and rest. Tomorrow, we start gathering evidence. I walked back to my apartment, that envelope of documents clutched against my chest like a weapon. Inside my small, modest home, so different from Julian and Cassandra's mansion built on stolen money, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at my kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a text message from Julian. Sorry I missed your call, Mom. Crazy busy day. Everything okay? Can I call you back tomorrow? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Everything's fine, honey. No rush. Talk soon. Because I wasn't ready to confront him yet. Not until I knew everything. Not until I had proof so overwhelming that even his silver tongue couldn't talk his way out of it. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. And when it was over, Julian and Cassandra were going to discover that the embarrassing old woman they dismissed so casually was about to become their worst nightmare. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of appointments, phone calls, and mounting evidence. Margaret became my partner in investigation, her decades of legal experience proving invaluable as we built our case piece by piece. The forensic document examiner, Dr. Raymond Torres, was a semi-retired expert who testified in over 200 fraud cases. He examined the signatures on the trust documents, the power of attorney, and the deed transfers with meticulous care, using specialized equipment to analyze pressure points, stroke patterns, and ink composition. His report, delivered 8 days after our initial consultation, was damning. Mrs. Whitmore, he said as we sat in his modest office in downtown Riverside, these signatures are forgeries. Very good forgeries, actually. Whoever did this had access to multiple examples of your genuine signature and practiced extensively. But they're not authentic. The pressure patterns are wrong. The hesitation marks that naturally occur in an elderly person's handwriting are absent, and most tellingly, the signatures were all created with the same pen using the same ink, despite supposedly being signed on different dates weeks apart. I felt vindicated and devastated in equal measure. So my son forged my signature. Or had someone forge it for him? I can testify to this in court, if necessary. The evidence is clear and unambiguous. Margaret had been equally busy. She tracked down the copy of the driver's license that Patricia Chun had kept in her notary records. The woman in the photo was blonde, appeared to be in her mid-60s, and wore expensive-looking clothes and jewelry. But the photo quality was poor, deliberately so, Margaret suspected, making it difficult to see facial features clearly. It's Cassandra, Margaret said with certainty as we examined the image together in her apartment. Look at the bone structure, the shape of the face. She's wearing a wig and aging makeup, but that's definitely her. Julian probably helped her create a fake ID using her information. We also discovered that Julian had been far busier with my finances than I'd realized. With help from my bank's fraud investigation department, who became very interested once I explained the situation, we traced a series of transactions that painted a picture of systematic theft. Over the 3 years since establishing the trust, Julian had sold Robert's commercial building for $1.4 million and used the proceeds to buy the Willowbrook property, transferred an additional $85,000 from my savings accounts into the trust's operating account, supposedly for property maintenance. But the money had been withdrawn in cash or transferred to accounts we couldn't trace, set up automatic transfers from my Social Security and pension payments to cover trust management fees that went directly into an account he controlled, used my credit in his name to open 3 credit cards that he'd maxed out and paid the minimum on, damaging my credit score, taken out a home equity line of credit on one of my legitimate rental properties, borrowing $120,000 that had disappeared into unknown accounts in total. We estimated Julian and Cassandra had stolen or misappropriated nearly $1.7 million from me over 3 years. The scope of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a single act of theft. It was a comprehensive, ongoing campaign of financial elder abuse, carefully planned and methodically executed. They've been treating you like a personal ATM, Margaret said grimly as we reviewed the financial records spread across her dining table. And they've been doing it while making you feel like you should be grateful for their attention, like you're the problem for being old and embarrassing. I thought about that dinner party, about Cassandra's public humiliation, about Julian's casual dismissal of my hurt feelings. It all made horrible sense now. They needed me to feel small and incompetent so I wouldn't question the financial arrangements, wouldn't assert myself, wouldn't look too closely at documents or accounts. I want them to pay for this, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Not just return the money, though I want every penny back. I want them to face consequences. Real consequences. Margaret looked at me seriously. Eleanor, if you pursue this criminally, Julian could go to prison. Elder financial abuse is a felony in this state. Combined with a forgery, fraud, and identity theft, he's looking at potentially 10 to 15 years. Are you prepared for that? He's been stealing from me for 3 years, I said flatly. He humiliated me. He made me question my own competence and worth. He treated me like an embarrassment while living in a mansion bought with my money. Yes, Margaret. I'm prepared for that. Then we need to bring this to the district attorney's office. But first, I think you should confront them. Give them a chance to confess, to show remorse. It'll be better for the prosecution if we have their reactions on record. How do we record them without their knowledge? Isn't that illegal? Margaret smiled grimly. In this state, only one party needs to consent to a recording. You can record your own conversations without telling the other parties. I suggest you invite them to dinner, somewhere neutral, somewhere you feel safe, and record everything. The idea formed slowly, deliciously. Not somewhere neutral, I said. Their house. The house they stole from me. I want to confront them in my own property, while they're living there illegally. That's poetic, Margaret admitted. But are you sure you want to go there alone? I won't be alone. You'll be with me. Eleanor, I don't think. Please, Margaret. I need someone there. Someone who knows everything, who can back me up if they try to gaslight me or make me question what I know. Please. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. But we do this carefully. We record everything, we stay calm, and if things get heated, we leave immediately and go straight to the police. Agreed. Agreed. I called Julian that evening, keeping my voice light and pleasant. Julian, honey, it's Mom. Do you and Cassandra have plans this Saturday evening? I don't think so. Why? I've been feeling badly about how things went at the last dinner party. I know I embarrassed you with my dentures, and I want to make it up to you both. I thought I could bring dinner over, nothing fancy, just some homemade lasagna and salad. Would that be all right? There was a pause. Mom, you don't need to do that. I want to. Please, Julian. Let me do this. It would make me feel so much better. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him calculating, wondering if there was an angle I was working. But what angle could there be? I was just the embarrassing elderly mother trying to apologize for existing. Okay, he said finally. That would be nice. Come over around 6. Perfect. I'll see you then. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling strangely calm. In 3 days, this would all be over. In 3 days, Julian and Cassandra would discover that the woman they dismissed as incompetent and embarrassing was about to destroy their perfect life. The next 3 days were busy with preparation. Margaret helped me organize all our evidence into a comprehensive dossier: bank records, forged documents, the forensic examiner's report, the notary's testimony, everything meticulously labeled and arranged. We made multiple copies, keeping sets in different locations in case Julian tried to destroy evidence. I also met with an attorney specializing in elder law and financial abuse. Catherine Morrison was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a reputation for aggressive representation of elderly clients. Mrs. Whitmore, she said after reviewing everything we'd gathered, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of elder financial abuse I've seen in 20 years of practice. Your son and daughter-in-law have committed multiple felonies. With this evidence, the DA will definitely prosecute. What happens next? First, we file for emergency injunctive relief to freeze all the accounts and prevent them from dissipating assets. Then we file a civil suit to recover all the stolen funds plus damages. Simultaneously, we refer the case to the DA's office for criminal prosecution. Your son and daughter-in-law will be arrested, probably within a week of the initial filing. And the house. The Willowbrook property will be returned to you, along with all equity and improvements. They'll be evicted immediately. Every penny they've stolen will be recovered, with interest. I nodded slowly. Do it. File everything. But wait until Monday to submit the paperwork. I'm confronting them Saturday night, and I want them to have no warning. Catherine looked concerned. Mrs. Whitmore, confronting them could be dangerous. If they realize you've discovered their fraud, I won't be alone. And I need to see their faces. I need to hear what they have to say for themselves. Please just trust me on this. She didn't look happy about it, but she agreed. Monday morning, first thing. The paperwork will be filed in civil court and submitted to the DA's office. By Monday afternoon, your son's life will start falling apart. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear, with golden leaves drifting from trees in the soft breeze. I spent the morning preparing lasagna, my hands steady as I layered pasta, ricotta, meat sauce, and mozzarella. I made a Caesar salad, baked garlic bread, and even prepared tiramisu for dessert. It all looked like a peace offering from an apologetic mother who knew her place. Margaret came over at 4 to help me pack everything and do a final equipment check. We had 2 digital recorders, one in my purse, one in Margaret's, plus our phones set to record audio. Everything was backed up to cloud storage in real time. Nothing would be lost. Nothing could be destroyed. Are you ready? Margaret asked as we loaded the food into her car at 5:30. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, I said. The drive to Willowbrook Lane felt different this time. I wasn't the nervous, hopeful woman who'd driven these streets 2 weeks ago, desperately seeking acceptance from her son and daughter-in-law. I was someone else now, someone harder, someone who'd been pushed too far, someone who was done being dismissed and diminished. We pulled up to the house at exactly 6 o'clock. Julian answered the door with a smile that looked genuine if you didn't know what I knew.
Mom.
Right on time. And you brought a friend? This is Margaret Porter, my neighbor. I hope you don't mind that I invited her along. She's been such a help to me lately, and I wanted you to meet her. Of course not. Come in, both of you. The house looked exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, stark, modern, cold. Cassandra appeared from the kitchen wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, her blonde hair in a casual ponytail. She looked surprised to see Margaret, but recovered quickly. Eleanor. How nice. And you've brought dinner. How thoughtful. The words were polite, but her tone made it clear she considered my homemade lasagna several steps below the catered meal she was accustomed to. "Let me help you get that set up in the kitchen," Julian said, reaching for the dishes I was carrying. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I'd like to eat in the dining room. At that beautiful table where we had dinner 2 weeks ago." It seemed appropriate. Something flickered in Cassandra's eyes. Suspicion, maybe, but she nodded. "Of course. Whatever you'd like." We set the table together, an awkward domestic scene with undercurrents of tension I could feel building. Margaret stayed close to me, her presence a comfort, and a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Finally, we all sat down, me and Margaret on one side of the table, Julian and Cassandra on the other. I served the lasagna, passed the salad, and played the role of the eager-to-please mother for several minutes while making small talk about the weather and Margaret's background. Then, as we were all eating, I set down my fork and looked directly at Julian. "Honey, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been reviewing my financial records, and I found some things that confused me. Can you help me understand them?" Julian's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind of things?" "Well, for instance, I didn't remember establishing the Whitmore Family Trust, or selling Robert's building on Commerce Street, or buying this house. It's strange, isn't it? To forget something so significant." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Cassandra's hand tightened on her wine glass. Julian set down his fork very carefully. "Mom, we discussed all of this. Remember? After Dad died, we set up the trust for estate planning purposes. I showed you all the documents."
"Did you?"
"Because I don't remember seeing any documents. And I certainly don't remember signing them." "You were grieving," Cassandra interjected smoothly. "You were on medication. It's understandable that the details are fuzzy." "That's what I thought too," I said pleasantly. "So, I had a forensic document examiner analyze the signatures on those documents. Dr. Raymond Torres, perhaps you've heard of him? He's an expert who's testified in over 200 fraud cases." Julian had gone very pale. "You did what?" "I had the signatures analyzed. And you know what Dr. Torres found? They're forgeries, Julian. Very good forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Those aren't my signatures on the trust documents, or the power of attorney, or the deed transfers." "That's ridiculous," Cassandra said, but her voice had lost its smooth confidence. "You signed those documents. Julian was there. I was there." "Were you?" "Because the notary, Patricia Chin, remembers meeting with a blonde woman in her mid-60s at this address to notarize the trust documents. But I've never lived at this address. And I don't have blonde hair. So who did Patricia meet with, Cassandra? Who pretended to be me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret pulled out her phone and placed it on the table, the recording app clearly visible. "Everything you say from this point forward is being recorded," she said calmly. "You might want to think carefully about your next words." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this. This is our home. You need to leave." "Your home?" I stood up too, my voice rising. "This is my home, Julian. I own this house. You bought it with money stolen from me, using forged documents and a fake identity. You've been living here for 3 years, paying rent to yourself with my own money while making me feel like an embarrassment for having clicking dentures." "Mom, please, if you'd just calm down. Don't tell me to calm down." The words exploded out of me with 3 years of suppressed hurt and rage. "You stole from me. You forged my signature. You sold my property. You used your own wife to impersonate me, and you did it all while treating me like I should be grateful for any attention you threw my way." "It wasn't like that," Julian said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "The money was going to be yours anyway, eventually. I was just managing it more efficiently." "Managing it? You stole $1.7 million from me. You maxed out credit cards in my name. You took out home equity loans on my rental properties. You systematically drained my accounts while making me think I was losing my mind." Cassandra stood up, her composure finally cracking. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. Do you know how expensive it is to maintain a certain standard of living in this community? The expectations, the social requirements. So you stole from an elderly woman to fund your lifestyle? Margaret's voice was cold as ice. You humiliated her at a dinner party, made her feel worthless and incompetent, all while living in luxury purchased with her money? She was fine. Cassandra's voice rose to a near shout. She had her little apartment, her pension, her bingo games. She didn't need millions of dollars. We put it to better use, investments, networking, building connections that would pay off in the long run. For you, I said quietly. Connections and investments that would pay off for you. While I lived in a one-bedroom apartment and worried about how to afford my medications. Julian finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse or guilt. It was annoyance, like I was being unreasonably difficult about a minor inconvenience. What do you want, Mom? An apology? Fine.
I'm sorry.
We'll work out some kind of repayment plan. I don't want an apology, Julian. I want justice. I reached into the large bag I'd brought and pulled out 3 thick manila envelopes. I placed one in front of Julian, one in front of Cassandra, and kept one for myself. These contain copies of all the evidence Margaret and I have gathered over the past 2 weeks. Forensic document analysis proving the signatures are forged. Bank records showing systematic theft. Testimony from the notary about the woman who impersonated me. Credit reports showing the damage you've done. All of it documented, dated, and verified. Julian opened his envelope with shaking hands. As he flipped through the pages, I watched the blood drain from his face. On Monday morning, I continued, my attorney is filing for emergency injunctive relief to freeze all your accounts and prevent you from dissipating assets. She's also filing a civil suit to recover every penny you've stolen, plus damages. And she's referring the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution? Cassandra's voice was barely a whisper. Elder financial abuse is a felony in this state. Combined with forgery, fraud, and identity theft, you're both looking at 10 to 15 years in prison. Maybe more if they decide to make an example of you. Julian was flipping through the pages frantically now, his expression shifting from shock to panic to desperate calculation.
Mom, wait. Please.
We can fix this. I'll transfer everything back. I'll return the money. I'll make it right. Just please don't go to the DA.
Why? I asked.
Why should I protect you from the consequences of your crimes? Because I'm your son.
His voice cracked.
I made mistakes, yes, but I'm still your son. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked at this man who'd grown in my body, whom I'd nursed and raised and loved with everything I had. This man who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised to take care of me. This man who'd systematically robbed me while making me feel like less than nothing. You stopped being my son the moment you decided I was just a resource to be exploited, I said quietly. The moment you made me scrub figurative floors while you entertained guests in my own stolen house. The moment you told me I was embarrassing you because my dentures clicked while I ate. That was Cassandra. Julian pointed at his wife. She's the one who humiliated you at dinner. She's the one who came up with this whole plan. I just went along with it because, oh, don't you dare. Cassandra turned on him with fury in her eyes. This was your idea from the beginning. You're the one who said your mother was too old and confused to manage her own finances. You're the one who forged the signatures. I just helped with the notary because you said it would be easier than trying to get her to sign while she was medicated. You helped commit fraud, Margaret interjected calmly. That makes you equally culpable. Throwing each other under the bus isn't going to help either of you now. I watched them turn on each other like rats in a trap and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. This was who they really were, not the sophisticated couple living the perfect life, but desperate criminals willing to betray anyone to save themselves. The police will be here in about 10 minutes, I said, checking my watch. I called them before we came over. They'll want to take statements from all of us. You called the police? Julian looked genuinely shocked, like he'd never actually believed I would follow through. Of course I did. You committed crimes against me. Serious crimes. Did you really think I would just let it go? But I'm your son, he said again, and this time there was genuine incomprehension in his voice. He actually didn't understand why his being my son wouldn't protect him from consequences. Yes, I said sadly. And I'm your mother, the woman who gave birth to you, who sacrificed everything to raise you, who loved you unconditionally for 32 years. But you never saw me as your mother. You saw me as an embarrassment, as an ATM, as someone whose money you were entitled to because you decided you deserved it more than I did. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The police had arrived right on time. Mrs. Whitmore? A uniformed officer entered through the front door that Margaret had quietly unlocked. We got your call. Is everything all right? Everything's fine now, officer. These are the people I told you about. I have extensive documentation of elder financial abuse, fraud, and forgery committed against me by my son and daughter-in-law. What followed was a blur of police procedure, statements taken, evidence collected, rights read. Julian and Cassandra were handcuffed and led out to separate patrol cars, their faces showing matching expressions of shock and disbelief. The sophisticated couple who'd entertained the Blackwells and moved through Riverside Estates society like royalty were now being arrested in their own driveway, neighbors peeking through windows at the spectacle. As they loaded Cassandra into the patrol car, she looked back at me with pure hatred. You're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see your son happy and successful. No, I said calmly. I'm a woman who refused to be stolen from anymore. There's a difference. Julian didn't say anything as they put him in the car. He just looked at me with something like wounded betrayal, as if I was the one who'd wronged him by refusing to be a silent victim. After they drove away, Margaret put her arm around my shoulders. How are you feeling? I thought about it honestly.
Sad. Relieved.
Angry. Vindicated. All of it at once. That's normal. You just had to have your own son arrested. Nobody feels good about that, even when it's justified. Will I get my money back? Most of it. Catherine is very good at asset recovery. The house is definitely yours. You'll be able to move in or sell it, whatever you prefer. The stolen funds might take longer to fully recover, but you'll get justice. Justice. It was a heavy word, but it felt right. Over the next 3 months, everything unfolded exactly as Catherine had predicted. Julian and Cassandra were formally charged with multiple felonies. They tried to fight it at first, hiring expensive attorneys and attempting to paint me as a confused elderly woman with faulty memories. But the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Torres's forensic analysis, Patricia Chen's testimony about the impersonation, the bank records showing systematic theft, all of it painted an undeniable picture of deliberate, calculated fraud. In the end, they took plea deals. Julian got 8 years, Cassandra got 6. Both would be eligible for parole after serving half their sentences, but their lives as they'd known them were over. The Riverside Estates house was returned to me, along with $1.3 million in recovered assets. Some of the money was gone forever, spent on luxury items that couldn't be recovered, but I got back enough to be more than comfortable for the rest of my life. I sold the Willowbrook house immediately. I couldn't imagine living there, not after everything that had happened. I used some of the proceeds to buy a larger apartment in Oakwood Gardens, one with 2 bedrooms so Margaret could have her own space when she stayed over, which was often. I also established a real trust, a legitimate one this time, with an independent trustee and proper legal oversight, to fund a foundation supporting victims of elder financial abuse. If my painful experience could help others recognize and escape similar situations, then maybe it would mean something. Julian wrote me letters from prison, lots of them. They followed a predictable pattern. Anger and blame at first, then bargaining and justification, finally what seemed like genuine remorse. I read them all but didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to him. Cassandra never wrote. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd filed for divorce immediately after being sentenced, eager to distance herself from Julian and his crimes. She'd be out of prison in 3 years if she behaved. I wondered what kind of life she'd build for herself after that, whether she'd learned anything or would just find new victims to exploit. As for me, I discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of everything. I was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy in ways I hadn't been in years, maybe decades. I had Margaret, who'd become more than a friend. She was family in ways Julian had never really been. I had financial security and the freedom to do things I'd only dreamed about: travel, hobbies, charitable work. And I had my self-respect back. I was no longer the woman who apologized for existing, who accepted humiliation because she didn't want to make waves. I was someone who'd stood up for herself, who'd refused to be a victim, who demanded justice and gotten it. 6 months after Julian and Cassandra's sentencing, I was invited to speak at a conference on elder financial abuse. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of social workers, attorneys, and advocates, I told my story from beginning to end. When my daughter-in-law told me to eat quietly because I was embarrassing them, I said, I believed her. I believed I was the problem, too old, too incompetent, too much of a burden. It took me weeks to understand that the real embarrassment wasn't my clicking dentures. It was their moral bankruptcy, their willingness to steal from someone who loved them, their cruelty disguised as sophistication. If you take nothing else from my story, take this: you are not an embarrassment. You are not incompetent. You are not a burden. You are a person deserving of dignity, respect, and honest treatment. And if the people in your life make you feel otherwise, even if they're family, especially if they're family, then they're the ones who should be embarrassed, not you. The applause that followed was thunderous. Afterward, dozens of people approached me, some sharing their own stories, others thanking me for my courage, many asking for advice on situations that sounded horrifyingly similar to what I'd experienced. I realized then that my story wasn't unique. There were thousands, maybe millions of elderly people being exploited by the very family members who were supposed to protect them. People who felt too ashamed or confused or guilty to speak up, to seek help, to demand justice. I made it my mission to be a voice for them. I gave more speeches, wrote articles, worked with advocacy organizations. I became someone who refused to let elder abuse hide in the shadows of family loyalty and social shame. And every time I spoke about that terrible dinner party, about clicking dentures and public humiliation and being told I was an embarrassment, I remembered the papers I eventually served. Not just legal documents, though those were satisfying enough, but the truth itself, delivered without apology or shame. The truth that I was not the embarrassment. They were. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here. Remember, you are never too old to stand up for yourself, and family ties don't give anyone the right to abuse you. Stay strong and know your worth.